Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Stronger with Time. I'm your host, Tony Battaji. In today's conversation, I sat down with Dr. Joanna McMillan. Dr. McMillan is a world expert in nutrition. We primarily talked about gut health, what it is, how do you measure it, what foods best support the health of our gut, and what foods we should be potentially avoiding. We talked about the role of bowel movements, gas, gastrointestinal disturbances, and all sorts of other really awkward questions. Joanna has got years of experience dealing with patients and research and does an expert job of translating research into practical advice. She is the author of 9 books, including a forthcoming book on fibre, and we had a great and humorous time talking about the role and the effects of fibre in human health. Without further delay, please enjoy this wonderful conversation with Dr. Joanna McMillan. Joanna, thank you for joining me.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, Tony.
This is a conversation that has been a long time in the making, so I'm so pleased we could finally connect.
Oh, it's really nice to see you. I mean, I used to speak to you fairly regularly, and yeah, so it feels like it's been a while. So it's a joy to talk to you.
I think we originally met in the fitness industry at conferences probably more than 20 years ago.
Definitely. I think it was when I was very first in Sydney, and I've now been here 26 years. Mm-hmm. And yeah, back then it would have been in the Philex days, going to fitness conventions, talking nutrition, and you always stretch my brain, Tony, as well as I have also trained with you. So you've stretched my muscles and my brain. So it's always really great to have these chats.
We never did as much training as you should have done, and I apologize because I was so interested in asking you questions about nutrition, which is my passion, that it extended your 60-second rest break into 10 minutes as we would dive into these topics of nutrition. So I apologize. 20 years later, I'm apologizing.
Oh, it's all good. It was probably in my favor to give me those little longer breaks, Tony. You had me lifting some serious weights.
We did. And you did some great feats of strength. I think that was all in preparation to climb Kilimanjaro from memory.
It was, that's right. And I managed it. I got there no problem. And actually, our guide that took us up there, I did it with my elder brother, and the guide that took us up there said when we got down, oh, the sister is very strong. So there you go. That was thanks to you, Tony.
Oh, that's great. I want to talk to you today about a lot of things. Like anyone, when they meet a nutritionist, dietitian, everyone has questions, but I primarily want to talk about gut health. And this is a topic I have been interested in forever. Apparently, my first giggle as a baby was when I farted. And I started giggling, according to my mother. So ever since then, I've been very, very interested. And speaking of that, I can remember sitting with a group of friends. One of them was a medical doctor in training. Group of people, he lifts his leg and he passes wind. And we all looked at him shocked. And he said, the healthy bowel produces 2 liters of gas a day. This is very normal. Is that true? How much gas do we actually produce a day?
It does. Well, look, it's very, very hard to know because, of course, can you imagine trying to do that experiment? But people have tried. So there was a famous study that did try to do that. And the best we've got is more around how many times people fart. So it is very normal to have, I think it's in the range of like 12 to 15 farts a day. But of course, it all depends. The thing about gas is that one, it is normal. I think we have, with our attempt at being more social and with more time indoors. I mean, I think one of my funniest moments was working on, when we were working, I think it was one of the ABC Catalyst shows. And I had this sort of brains trust of various experts from different fields. And the gastroenterologist on my team said to me, Joanna, I really think a lot of these gut problems are coming from people holding their farts in. And I said, oh, really? Seriously? And she said, I honestly think, and she told me this story of one of her clients who was a roofer, so his job was primarily outdoors, and he'd recently got together with his girlfriend and they'd moved in together. And his girlfriend kept telling him off and telling him something was wrong with him because he was farting so much. So he was trying to hold his farts in. And she said she honestly believed a lot of his gut trouble and his complaints and pain and discomfort that she was coming to her with were all to do with that. So I've always thought of that story in the back of my mind and thought, yes. And her theory, which other people have now talked about, is that we spend much more time indoors, much more time in contact with other people where it's not so socially acceptable to be passing wind. Whereas when we were all outside a lot more and working in fields and hunting and gathering and spending most of our days outside, then it wouldn't have been so much of an issue. So I think we have to normalize farting. Everybody laughs. I'm so glad to hear you did as a baby, and I hope you still are today, because surely it
Oh,
still is one of the funniest things in the world.
oh, just ask my kids. I'm obsessed. But I can really relate to that roofer because I can remember having a Bircher muesli for breakfast and then going on a first date with my now partner. And I held it in. When that car door shut and she was gone, I can tell you, I was in a lot of pain and I was glad for her to go.
Yeah, it's an absolute truth. My grandmother used to always take, she was very polite, my grandmother, and quite proper, and she would take herself off to the bathroom just to fart. And and then come back to the room. And I thought, now we all need to just adopt that. Just leave the room or go outside or go to the bathroom briefly and then come back and you'll be a lot more comfortable. So yeah, there's nothing, a lot of the bloating and discomfort and pain that people describe is from either trying to hold farts in, but also from wind getting trapped, which is often due to constipation, which is probably one of the most common gut problems that we get today because of both the way that we live and move and the way that we're eating. So I think it's really this is a great place to start the conversation because sometimes we overlook the obvious things and people start asking me about food intolerances and
Hmm.
allergies and the
Hmm.
gut microbiome. And instead of stepping back and saying, "Oh, am I actually constipated? Am I recognizing the normality of how often I fart? Is it really a problem? Or am I actually just having normal physiology?"
Yeah, let's explore that. And just before we do, maybe we should adopt my dad. He's an elderly man, but he's deaf. So he doesn't hear himself. So he will just be walking around and just letting it go. And he doesn't know he's doing it. We all know. And my poor mum, she has dementia. So she does it. And as soon as she does it, she's forgotten she did it. So we should just maybe normalize these things. But let's explore this. How many times a day should we pass stool? I have a friend, a very close friend of 50 years. He might go every few days. Every few days. I have other friends that they eat a meal and they have to go within 15 minutes. So it's 3, 4 times a day.
Hmm.
What is the normal amount? Because I'm assuming that every 3 days is probably not healthy.
That's probably not healthy, although it can be normal for some people. So the trouble is, some people will go several times a day. Some people will go every 2 or 3 days. Some people, it's just once in the morning. My father was a get up, has his coffee, goes straight to the toilet. And that was him for his entire life. So there's all these different normals. What's more important is how easily it is for you to go. If you're going every 3 days, but you're then struggling to go and it looks more like sort of rabbit droppings and you don't feel like you've emptied and you're struggling and straining to pass the stool, then you've got a problem. You're very definitely
Well,
constipated.
he
But
sounded like he was going for an Olympic clean and jerk because I heard it in the other room. It was a strain.
okay, that's sounding problematic. He's
All
likely
right.
to end up with hemorrhoids. He increases his risk of diverticulitis. He increases his risk of colon cancer because when you get constipated, you've got those contents in your colon hanging around for a lot longer. So you've got that potential for toxins and other things to be hanging around instead of being cleared out of the colon. And that's one of the things that I think gets forgotten about constipation. We think it's just a discomfort and, oh yeah, okay, it's probably not good for us to strain, but actually it's got very potentially serious consequences unless you sort it out. So it's not something to sweep under the carpet. It's also very uncomfortable. I think most of us have been constipated at some point after a long flight or a period of you've been ill and you've been in bed or for all sorts of reasons. It's quite normal to occasionally get constipated. But if you have chronic constipation, it's really something you need to address.
Yeah, I was on opioids last year for a back incident for a week,
Mm,
and those things block you up harder
they
than the
sure do.
freeway traffic on a Friday of a long weekend. So I know all about that. Let's talk about on the other end of the spectrum. What should the stool look like? Should it be firm, easy to pass? Should it be liquid? I can't even believe we're having this conversation, but let's just let it go where it needs to go.
Exactly. You got to talk about these things, right? Or people don't know. Well, we've got the old Bristol Stool Chart, which I always find a bit hilarious because, again, that was based on a very small community at the end of the day. And now it's been adopted. It was also done a very long time ago. It's now been adopted by doctors all over the world to show you this little start with the chart with these pictures of stools and say which one looks most like yours. And it kind of goes from very diarrhea looking loose stool up to very sort of like the rabbit droppings we talked about before. And then they talk about it being somewhere in the middle where you've got a nicely formed kind of sausage looking poo. And that's where you want to be. Now, I question the Bristol Stool Chart because, to be honest, while the extremes are undoubtedly not where you want to be, I actually believe there's a lot more of movement within those sort of central parts because so much depends on various things that can impact the speed with which food, it's called the transit speed or the gut transit speed, which is just the time it takes for your body to digest certain foods and then to evacuate everything at the other end. So various things can speed up that speed, and it's not always the same from day to day, depending on what you've done, what your movements are. I'm sitting here drinking coffee. Coffee tends to speed up that gut transit, which is why a lot of the time people will go to the toilet immediately after having their coffee in the morning. All these things can impact traveling on a plane, I mentioned, sitting in a car for a long time, having a day at your desk, or you're out and you're active and you've gone for a run. I often say, ask a regular runner if they're constipated. I bet you 9.5 times out of 10, it's going to be no. So all of these things will impact how fast your gut is contracting. And that impacts how loose the stool is. So I don't know. I think that more study actually has to be done to update that Bristol Stool Chart and to recognize what might be normal. So I would just say if you're very constipated or you've got repeatedly very loose stools, especially when it's accompanied by other symptoms like gut pain, discomfort, or urgency, and you're struggling. And I've had clients in the past who would say, well, no, I don't like going out anywhere because I always have to know where the bathroom is. So that's clearly something that is then impeding your life. Then you really want to look at what's going on here and can we do something about it? But there's a degree of normality somewhere in the middle.
When we hear the word gut health, it is one of these buzzword that is thrown around. What does it actually mean? When we talk about the health of the gut, what do people like you intend by those two words?
What I intend by gut health, at least, is you want a well-functioning gut that is digesting your food really well, absorbing your nutrients as it's designed to do. It's very clever. The gut is often described as if it's just a great big long tube, but it's much more complex than that. And each part of the gut has its own job. Even within the small intestine, there's specialist cells that do specialist things. We absorb different nutrients at different parts of that small intestine. And then, of course, the colon is doing another job altogether. So it's a very, very clever system. And if all those parts of the system are working correctly, that's a healthy, functioning gut. And lots of things can go wrong. But I think also one of the things to recognize is that we've lost sight of also what's normal. I've seen people who are very clearly bloated, who look like they're pregnant after a couple of hours after eating a meal or by the middle of the afternoon, and they're so uncomfortable. You can clearly see that there's some issue there. But I've also experienced people who have got it in their head that they're bloated and that this is abnormal, when actually what their experience is, or they say their gut's really noisy, or they've got excessive amounts of wind, or whatever it might be. And actually what they're describing is perfectly normal. So I think it's very important to start to recognize that your gut does make noises, that sometimes you do get uncomfortable. You can try to, if those things are happening regularly, you can try to explore what's going on there. But some of it is just your normal gut physiology. And there's an awful lot of misinformation out there with diagnosing all sorts of different things. And it can be hard. It can be hard to get diagnoses for, I don't know, things like SIBO and irritable bowel syndrome and other things that can be hard to investigate, and even food intolerances and food allergies. They can be difficult to, especially food intolerances, to actually diagnose. So there's a lot of self-diagnosis going on, a lot of misdiagnosis, going to all sorts of different so-called experts who may not have such a science-based and clinical test for what they're diagnosing. And that can lead to problems. So I've certainly experienced lots of people talking to me about being on very restrictive diets or cutting all sorts of things, probably unnecessarily from their diets, and potentially doing more harm in the long term. So you've got to be really careful around gut health and actually really recognizing what's right for you.
That must be extremely hard to work out the difference between normal gut function, normal bloating associated with fiber and liquid going through the GI tract versus something that is pathological. So how can we determine the difference before we go and get testing? Because I meet numerous people virtually every day who have told me they can't eat X, Y, and Z because they have bloating. And then when I look at that food, it's just simply the fiber that's moving through them. And we often think that that's not normal when actually it is normal. How can we tell the difference between a gut that is unhealthy? What are those signs and symptoms versus just normal gut function or gut noises? When I eat food, I have a tremendous amount and when I go to sleep, I think my gut is like talking, making a noise, like that Seinfeld episode, la, la, la. So, and by the way, my favorite medical word in the world is the medical term for gut noises.
I was hoping you were going to pronounce it, not me.
Oh, no, I can't pronounce borborygmus. Borborygmus. It's a difficult one.
Which shows you it's normal, right? It's got its own name. So, it happens to all of us.
Correct. So what's pathological and what's normal?
Well, I think not a bad way of looking at it is it impeding your life? Is the pain, discomfort, what you're perceiving as, because the other thing to say here is there's a perception from your brain. So one of the things that we've come to realize and understand about irritable bowel syndrome is that for some of those people with irritable bowel, and irritable bowel, by the way, is a large bucket of everybody getting chucked in the same basket or the same bucket, but actually can have very different issues. But there's a subset of those people with irritable bowel who have what we now call a sort of hypersensitive gut. So it's like the signals between the gut and the brain are overly triggered so that the same amount of gas that you or I might produce and perceive as normal and not have any discomfort and happily go for a walk and have a little walk fart and feel fine, or go to the bathroom and you feel good again. In that person with a hypersensitive gut, actually the same amount of gas can trigger pain. And it's real pain because the brain is perceiving it as pain, but it's like it's too trigger happy. And that can be dealt with by, actually there's gut directed hypnotherapy now, which is clinically tested, good trials on, even places like Monash are in their gut clinics are using gut directed hypnotherapy to try to help to sort of calm down those signals between the gut and the brain. So that's the other thing to bear in mind. But I would say, look, you do have an issue and you want to address it if it's impeding your life. If you're at either of those extremes that we talked about in the Bristol Stool Chart, so you're either getting constipated or you're having very loose stool several times a day that's impeding your ability to go out and live your life, or you're getting excessive pain, discomfort, and if it's painful, there's something going on. There is some issue there. And that's the things that I would really look at. But the last point to make is to your point about fiber, is that we've got ourselves into a situation where most people are not eating nearly enough fiber. They're also chronically dehydrated. They're not drinking enough water, which fiber really needs to swell in the gut. So fiber can block you up if you don't accompany it with lots of water. And we've got people being far too sedentary, even if they're doing their gym workout 3 or 4 times a week. If they're then sat at a desk for the rest of the time and sat in a car, sat in the bus, sat on the sofa watching TV in the evening, that's a lot of sedentary time. And when your body is sedentary and a lot of sitting time, your gut is also quite sedentary. So we've got all of these things that can impact on that gut health. And then if you've got a chronically low fiber intake and then you suddenly eat fiber, oh my God, there's a party in your gut. The wrong microbes might be digesting that fiber, producing excessive gas, or it is the right microbes, but they're so excited, they're getting a meal. You get this overreaction, and then you think, oh, I can't tolerate those foods. Whereas actually, if you just stuck with it and you introduced fiber really nice and slowly, and you did it over a period of 3 or 4 weeks, your gut slowly adapts, your microbiome changes, starts changing within 24 hours. It's extraordinary. And you start getting that adaptation, and then suddenly suddenly your body is used to it. So that's a really important message, because I think a lot of people get turned off and think, oh no, I can't tolerate those foods, because they just go too hard too quickly.
How would one test their gut health if they're thinking, well, I would like to go and measure it. I can measure my blood glucose. I can measure my blood pressure. Is it the same thing as having your microbiome tested?
I would say at this point in time, be very careful if you're going to take the step towards getting your gut microbiome tested. It is not a diagnostic tool at this point in time, at least. There's an awful lot we don't yet know about the gut microbiome. We can now measure it. There's some very good new techniques that get right down to the species level. So University of Queensland researchers were some of the earliest people I worked with a company called Microba that they've now set up commercially. It's now, I think they've renamed actually to Cobiome. And what I've always liked about what they're doing is they give you your results as your insights result. So a gut microbiome test can give you insights. It can certainly show you what your gut microbiome looks like, but what it can't do is give you a diagnosis. So it can pick up, oh, you've got, if there's sort of pathogenic species there, of course, a regular stool test with your doctor can pick that up. It can pick up if you've got a lack of diversity and variability. It will pick up and give you a measure of some of the functions of your gut microbiome, which is actually more important really than the individual species. And all of those things can be insightful and give you some direction as to what sorts of foods or what lifestyle changes you can make to improve that gut microbiome in as far as the knowledge that we have so far. But there's a lot of, at the moment, it's that cause and effect thing. What is caused by the gut microbiome, and what are we looking at in the gut microbiome that is simply caused by your diet and exercise and other lifestyle factors? So it's not a diagnostic tool. So I would not suggest that as a first line approach. Your first line approach is always to go to your doctor first. Don't even come to a dietitian like me until you've seen a doctor, and your doctor will rule out any medical cause. So the doctor may do some tests themselves. They may do a regular stool test to check if you've got Giardia or C. difficile or some of these pathogenic type infections that might well just be calling. I mean, I had Giardia, I remember a number of years ago. It took me months and 2 rounds of antibiotics to try to get rid of it. And that was causing all of my gut symptoms. It wasn't food intolerances. It wasn't some FODMAP problem. It was purely that I had picked up from a water supply in the country, I'd picked up this particular bug, and it can be nasty to get rid of. So that's your first line of thought. They may also refer you to a gastroenterologist and get a colonoscopy or an endoscopy if the problem's up top. And that can only go so far, of course. You can't get right into the middle of your gut. You can go in either end and kind of have a look around to a certain point, but it can't get right into the center of your gut. So those are the sort of best tests we've got so far. Once medical things have been ruled out and you think, okay, this truly is related to diet, that's when to ask for a referral to a dietitian who specializes in this area. And then you can start going down the route of food intolerances, is irritable bowel syndrome, and so on, because there's all sorts of things that it can be. And the last tip then is to try not to self-diagnose. I know we've got ChatGPT and Dr. Google, and it's so tempting to get online and think, I'll just self-diagnose. But I can give you a very serious word of warning in that. My dad did it. And I kept telling my dad, it's not diverticulitis. Dad, you need to get a colonoscopy. And by the time he finally did go to a doctor and get a proper diagnosis, he had final stage colon cancer. So do not self-diagnose and think that you've worked out what it is. And he thought it was a post-COVID, well, everyone's getting long COVID and it's all affecting the gut. And he did all this self-diagnosis because he had his head in the sand. So it's really important that you get a medical diagnosis first, then see a gut specialist, dietitian, or other health expert in that space to help you.
There's no shortage of different commercially available gut tests that you can get, that they're non-rebated, they're very expensive, and they're often just a simplistic way of looking at the microbiome and not even telling you what's going on. I read a paper from Rob Knight who looked at, I think, maybe 8 different ways the microbiome could be assessed. And they show you different things. So this should not be the first line of action if you've got gut issues. I think that's a really great point that you've made. Before we jump into fiber, what are some of the outside of the gut benefits of having good gut health? I'm thinking in particular of the brain.
Well, I literally, the line I often use is gut health is not, literally is in the center of your body, and it impacts pretty much everything. It impacts your gut to your brain and everything in between. So we hear quite a lot about the gut brain axis, but we actually have a gut lung axis, a gut heart axis, a gut kidney axis. We've got all of these impacts, and the gut microbiome is facilitating some of those impacts. Your diet can have direct effects by things that we absorb from our food. There's direct mechanistic impacts of fiber within the gut. But then we've also got the involvement of the gut microbiome that alters some things that are present in our diet, making them more biologically active within our bodies. Some of those things can then be absorbed and go to the brain and even get across the brain barrier to get into your brain and then impact brain function in that way. Similarly, they can impact the way that your liver is managing your cholesterol profile, managing your blood glucose. So it's not just about what you've eaten. Your gut microbiome is involved. And the book I've just finished writing is on this very topic. And literally I go through the impact of how fiber impacts your brain, how it impacts your heart health, how it impacts inflammation in your body, how it impacts detoxing, which I think is something people don't really recognize. They pick up and spend a lot of money on these ridiculous detox kits in the chemist, or they do a juice cleanse, which I've given a study that looked at juice cleanses, which actually had a negative impact on the gut microbiome. So I'll very much direct you away from those kinds of approaches. But yes, fiber is involved in the natural detox systems within the body. So it's not just gut health. It really is this overall knock-on effect from everything from your mood to what's driving you to eat particular foods. So even your food preferences can be impacted by what's going on within your gut. And then, of course, there's the gut health itself, both in terms of day-to-day comfort and function, and then long-term risk of various health problems, including colon cancer. So it's really pretty extraordinary when you think of that. Although it's extraordinary, but then when you think about it, you think, well, the gut is the center of nutrient absorption, of digesting food, of getting rid of the stuff that you don't. It's a very key part of detoxing and getting rid of the stuff that we don't want in our bodies. So when you think of it that way, then and 70% of your immune system is in your gut. So then you think, okay, well, yeah, it's not really that surprising that the gut should be such a central role to all of body health.
What do you say to people who then insist, by extension of that, we should just eat fibrous foods and all animal foods are not being metabolized in the gut? We weren't designed to eat them. On the other end of the spectrum, to say we don't need any fiber at all and we can have an animal-based diet and look at teeth architecture or stomach acid and try and make arguments. Like always, usually the truth is right in the middle, which is not particularly sexy and doesn't sell as much. But what do you say to both sides of that debate?
I say that they're both wrong.
Right.
And it's very clear. It's very, very clearly wrong. If we just look at the way that the gut is designed and built, it gives us, and then we can look at what nutrients our bodies really need. The way that our bodies are designed, and way back when you and I first met, Tony, paleo diets were all the thing. And that was back when I was doing my PhD and I looked at high meat, high protein diets because I was in the fitness industry. I was interested in these kinds of approaches. So I did a lot of research around Paleolithic nutrition. It's before it became the really popular diet. Now it's sort of fallen off in the end, but we have had this emergence of carnivore, which is avoiding almost all plant foods and eating almost entirely animal foods. And then we've got this very driven agenda of trying to get people to have more plant-based. And as you say, the truth is in the middle. The way the gut is designed is that we are designed to eat both animal and plant foods. We know this from the way the jaw is constructed. There's even some really interesting work coming out showing our jaws are getting smaller and muscles diminishing and people aren't getting their teeth coming in correctly because we're not chewing food enough anymore. We've got too soft food that's easy to eat. So we're supposed to chew fibrous vegetables. It's actually really good for kind of cleaning your teeth before we had toothbrushes and toothpaste. So the way that we eat, and we're designed to chew meat. And then when you look at the nutrients that we need, there's some nutrients that we can only get from animal food. Vitamin B12 is the obvious one, but long chain omega-3s we can't get in plant foods. The omega-3s that are present in plants are the short chain versions of these. And we have a limited capacity to elongate them and make the long chain omega-3s that are so important for brain health if we only follow a plant-based diet. And your genes impact that. I know that I have the gene variant that is especially not good at doing that. So following an entirely plant-based diet would be a disaster for me. And then we've got other nutrients that we absorb best from animal foods. So we might be able to get them in plant foods. Iron is the obvious example. If you're a woman, you're premenopausal, so you're still menstruating, or for whatever other reason, you've got a really big iron requirement, it's very hard to meet that iron requirement from only plant foods. And if you're in that camp, you can eat as much plant food as you like, and you're probably going to end up being iron deficient. And that's a seriously underdiagnosed. I think I'm right in saying iron deficiency is still the most common nutrient deficiency worldwide. So we tend to overlook those things. Similarly, at the other end of the scale, following a carnivore diet, there's arguments from that camp around, oh, but some Paleolithic communities, some traditional communities eat very little plant food. The Inuit are the sort of obvious example. And there's some other rare hunting tribes that they might pick out that they say, well, they survive on this. This is a true paleo diet. But when you look, there is not one paleo diet. There were many. And actually, one of the things about the human race that's probably been one of our successes is that we're highly adaptable. Us and rats are probably the animal species of the planet that can best adapt to all sorts of different ways of eating. And that's witnessed by when we look all around the world. I love to travel, and everywhere I go, I kind of try to look at what are the traditional foods, what are people eating? And there are some commonalities. We've obviously got a foundation of foods that we require, but we can adapt very nicely to all sorts of different ways of eating. So there's a spectrum there between animal and plant foods. If you want to be 100% plant-based for whatever reason that you've decided that's the way you want to eat, of course you can, but you're going to have to take some supplements if you want to have optimal health and well-being. And I've got grave concerns about what happens if children are raised on an entirely plant-based diet. What are the long-term consequences, especially for things like brain health? You know, we don't truly know those things. But I would certainly, yes, you can survive on 100% plant-based. You need to take great care, though, to try to best meet your nutrient needs. And you're probably going to have to take some supplements, certainly vitamin B12 as an absolute minimum. The carnivore people, I mean, Joe Rogan described going on the carnivore diet, including his explosive toilet episodes where he had terrible problems with explosive diarrhea over that month. Yet still people think that that was a good sign of why we should have the carnivore diet. It's just nuts to me. There is no evidence to support the idea that we're best suited to no plant foods at all and only animal foods. So I think for most of us, there's a spectrum in between. The line isn't definite. There's not a definite proportion of both. I prefer to use the word fiber or the term fiber rich. All of us, whether you're a vegan or an omnivore, need to have fiber. And so I prefer a plant-rich diet that will then ensure that diversity of different fiber types, that diversity of polyphenols and other phytonutrients. And then you're including the very nutrient-dense animal foods. So good quality animal foods that are giving us some very key nutrients. And that balance is absolutely key. That's really the way the gut is designed and the body has evolved and designed to be able to best get our nutrition.
Are there parts of the animal that you think are really nutrient dense that you would recommend for everyone?
Look, I'm very much a fan. Over the last few years, I've become increasingly interested in sustainability and what that means. So from that perspective, I think it's important we do the whole sort of nose to tail stuff. Don't just buy the chicken breast, buy the whole chicken. Use all of the meat, use the carcass to make a stock and turn that into another meal. So I think that kind of utilization of the whole animal is really important. When it comes to other offal and heart and liver and all those sorts of things, those things can be very, very nutritious, but they may not appeal to our tastes anymore. We've got used to certain ways of eating, and I'll have liver patty, but I don't particularly want to eat. My father used to love steak and kidney pie. It was never my favorite thing to be eating those kidneys. So look, those things can be good. Liver is often talked about as being incredibly nutritious, and it is, but it can also be a source of toxins and other things that have kind of got wrong and got into that particular animal. So no, the answer is I would just try to get variety, whether we're talking about plants or animal foods. The greater the variety, so buy different cuts. When it comes to animal foods, often they're the more expensive foods you're putting into your trolley of all of the fresh foods. So I would say nothing's wrong with buying those cheaper cuts. You just have to learn how to cook them differently. So long, slow cooking is generally what you want with some of those cheaper cuts. And you'll never persuade me off a really beautifully cooked fillet steak. But you want to accompany that with loads of plant foods. So the variety is absolutely key. The more different animals, foods that you eat, from eggs to dairy to different types of meat, different types of fish, different types of shellfish and other seafood, the more variety you have, the better. The more likely you are to meet your nutrient requirements and not get too much of any one thing. And then the same is true of plants. You want as great diversity. You've probably heard the old 30 plus plant foods a week that's bandaged around, not based on any strong, solid evidence, but it's not a bad benchmark to have. And it's not hard to do if you start really counting up how many different, do you always buy the same vegetables every week? Or do you vary what you buy? What, are you always eating the same fruits without mixing it up? Are you always eating almonds and never eating any other type of nut? So the minute we start sort of improving our biodiversity, that's good for our diets. It's good for our guts. And it's certainly good for the environment in terms of biodiversity.
And that's what I try and do in a practical sense, is always buy a different type of food. Aim for 5 different colors when I'm looking at plants per meal, whatever is seasonal. But always, if I bought this, I'll try and buy something different. A way that I hide organ meat, and my kids won't be listening to this, so they're not going to know my secret, but I can get mince that is 50% beef mince and then 50% organ. And no one knows. And it goes into the bolognese or goes into the stir fries, and they just think that they're getting mince. But then the kids are having heart and kidney and liver and so forth. So that's another way that I'm doing it. Let's turn our attention to fiber, because it's a catch-all term. When people hear fibrous foods, they often think of insoluble fiber. But fiber comes in a number of different forms, including resistant starch. So would you tell us, you've just written a book on this, what is fiber? What are the different types? And before you answer that, did you start eating differently once you did all the research to write a book? If anyone doesn't know this, it takes a lot of reading. So did you change your practice on fiber when you did all your work?
You'll notice I'm wearing glasses these days, Tony.
Yeah.
I'm sure I've just worn my eyes out.
Yeah.
Yes, look, it very much did. I always learn. I mean, I think writing a book, you learn as much as your readership does at the end of the day, because it's such a journey. And even though that this is a topic I've been talking about, gosh, since long, I mean, my honours project back when I was doing my Bachelor of Science in Scotland all those years ago, 30 odd years ago now, was actually looking at the little oligosaccharides that are in beans, which of course we now know are very strong prebiotics, but this was very early in the prebiotic research. And that's what I was doing, simply measuring them. What are these oligosaccharides that are present in beans? So my history of looking at fiber and gut health really goes back then. But in that 30-year period, of course, the research has moved on hugely. So one of the things, I mean, you asked about soluble and insoluble was the classic way of sort of grouping fibers together. And the first thing to recognize that is I deliberately use the plural of fiber. It's actually fibers, because there's many different types of fiber. But in essence, they're carbohydrates. They're carbohydrates that we can't digest. And so therefore they travel through the small intestine. Some of them become food for the gut microbiome. So your gut bugs can digest them in a way, they ferment them. And some of them, they can't either, and they'll pass straight through the body. But one of the things that I uncovered was an Australian paper, actually, which has managed to come up with a new way of grouping different fibers, which really highlights to that point around fiber diversity. So rather than just simply grouping fibers as soluble and insoluble, it recognizes that there's actually many different components. So things like the structure, how well it absorbs water, how well fermented it is. There's sort of 5 different categories. There's the charge of the particular fiber and so on. So I talk about this in the book and really only as an illustration to say this is why there's not one fiber that's going to have all of the benefits. You need to get that diversity of all these different fibers because they all have slightly different roles. So that's the thing to recognize about fiber. And then you mentioned resistant starch. This adds another little spanner into the works in a way, but it's a good one because resistant starch is literally what the name says. It does what it says on the tin. This is starch that has what we call retrograded. Starch has altered. And instead of us then being able to digest it, it becomes fiber. And why resistant starch is so important is that it's like the premium fuel for your really good gut bugs. So things like bifidobacteria and other species that we know to have these beneficial knock-on effects. And it's really, they love resistant starch. They'll ferment it very, very readily. So we want to have more resistant starch. And some of the work done at CSIRO here in Australia has shown that not only do we have a fibre gap for most Australians, we're not eating enough total fibre, we're also extremely short on resistant starch. And so even if you're getting fibre up by getting what my mum used to refer to as roughage, you can get your roughage up by using bran on your cereal or trying to eat all bran in the morning or going for a whole grain bread. But you might not be getting enough resistant starch. And so we need that balance of all of these different types of fibre. So the good news about resistant starch is that some of it is naturally present in foods like beans and chickpeas, lentils, in some whole grains and so on. But actually it's also formed when we cook and cool starchy foods. So hello, potato salad, you're suddenly looking really good. Hello, pasta that you cooked last night for the family and you've heated it up for lunch today. So pasta, rice, quinoa, any of those starchy foods, when you cook them and you cool them, you get some of that starch converting into resistant starch. And so that's really good news for your gut microbiome. And the other thing is it doesn't matter if you then reheat that food. The resistant starch doesn't break down again, so it's still in that food. So so it's a really good way of going, yeah, those foods are fantastic, done as leftovers or made into a salad the next day.
That's the primary way I get resistant starch, is taking to work the next day what I cooked the previous, but it's been cooled overnight, and it's pasta, it's rice, it's potatoes. How much of fiber and resistant starch makes its way to muscle glycogen versus going all into the fermentation process in the gut?
It'll all be fermented. Resistant starch is such a readily fermented fuel for the gut microbiome. They convert it into short chain fatty acids primarily. And we do get a little bit of energy, therefore, from those short chain fatty acids. But things like butyrate has received a lot of attention. And you've got particular species that are very good at fermenting things like resistant starch and some of the other fermentable fibers, creating butyrate that actually keeps the cells that line your colon healthy because it's their fuel source. So every cell needs a source of energy and they all use slightly different things. So your brain primarily likes glucose, your red blood cells like glucose. Well, the colonic cells like butyrate. And then some of the other ones are absorbed, but butyrate also has this anti-inflammatory effect in the body. Some of the other short chain fatty acids go to the liver where they are sort of signaling molecules, and some of them get to the brain and across into the brain where they have a neuroprotective effect and they impact some of the communications between your brain cells. So all of these things happen from that fermentation process. What you do want to watch with resistant starch, going back to where we started our conversation in terms of gas and bloating, if you have a whole load of resistant starch, but you don't have other types of fiber in there, the resistant starch can make you very gassy and can make you have that discomfort and bloating once it reaches your colon. So not immediately after eating, but if it's once several hours later, it can even be the next day when it's reached and it's being fermented in the gut. If there aren't other fibers there right early up in the colon, you'll have this party going on, all this gas produced, and you think, oh, I didn't tolerate that food. But actually, if you'd had that resistant starch along with even the insoluble fibers, one of the reasons they're important, they don't absorb water. They're not fermentable to any great degree by the microbiome. But what it does is it's like a carrier. So it helps to carry that resistant starch, slow down the fermentation of it so that some of that fermentation is still going on in the very distal part of the colon. And that's key because that's where most cancers start occurring late on in the colon. So we want that sort of mixture of different types of fiber to ensure we get nice, steady fermentation throughout the colon, not a big party all in one go. And then you're going to feel a lot more comfort and get all of the benefits of those different types of fiber.
Yes, I have a friend who made that mistake by having too much resistant starch. And yeah, he reports he was not a very happy camper. So he tells me. Let's talk about the two different population groups, because Louise Burke has just recently written a paper on fiber being the forgotten nutrient for athletes who are very focused on the old term of simple carbohydrates for fueling. And then on the other end of the spectrum, I'll have many, especially female clients, who have their carbohydrates, but they're all fiber. They're all either resistant starch or plant-based fibers, and they're not getting their glycogen. And you mentioned something really important, that is a message that I didn't want to be missed, is that if you are eating carbohydrate for your regular training every day, but it's primarily fiber-based plants, you might actually be undershooting your performance carbohydrate needs.
Well, that's a really good point. We're getting into the realms of personalized nutrition, and this is what sometimes so quickly gets forgotten. Someone was asking me yesterday, but how do I know if I'm getting my nutrition from a good source? And one of the things I said was, if you've got someone telling you this is the way to eat, then ignore them, because there's not just one way to eat. And one of the things that you have to take on board are, what are my individual needs? So if you're an athlete, even across the course of your week, you're going to want to eat slightly differently in terms of your timing of things like fiber, or in terms of actually what's my primary goal here. If you are about to go and compete in a triathlon, I remember the morning before, it was about 10 years ago when I did my half Ironman. And I remember going, God, this is a dreadful breakfast. On the event day, there I was having white toast. I was having cornflakes, no butter on the toast because I didn't want fat slowing down the processes and food leaving my stomach. I wanted to have an empty stomach when we started the race. And it was so alien to me eating these foods that had very little fiber. I didn't want a lot of protein that morning. I just wanted the carbs. So I was eating stuff that was going to be broken down, make sure my glycogen was topped up, make sure my blood glucose was ready for starting to compete in that longer type event. So that's a very different situation. But as soon as the event was over, I was back to my fiber rich. Yes, I still needed carbs on board to replenish my body stores. And I, of course, needed protein then to support the muscle repair process. But you needed, again, that combination of carbs that were going to feed me, and then the carbs, which are fiber, to feed my gut microbiome and get those knock-on effects. So you've got to personalize it to what your particular needs are. If you're just the average person doing exercise recreationally and for health, and for most of the time, then you can just think about those fiber-rich foods. You don't need any of those real quick, unless you're struggling with blood glucose levels or competing in an event like that, or going for a long run or these kinds of things. Then you can start sort of personalize a bit more. But if you're an athlete, then you have to think a wee bit more about that. And from my experience, it's many years ago, I did my sports dietetic training. I don't work in this area anymore, but I remember my time at the AIS, and all of the sports dietitians there said the two things that they change most regularly in athletes' diets is that carbohydrate loading. They're very often not eating enough carbohydrate, because even athletes are impacted by this sort of influence of what sometimes gets called carb phobia. So even they get impacted by that. So not eating enough carbs. And then the second thing is protein distribution. So getting too much protein in one meal instead of distributing it across the course of the day. Those were the two sort of most common things that they dealt with.
Okay, well, let's wrap up this conversation on fiber by having a related term. And you've mentioned that fiber is fermented. And then we go into the world of fermented food. And we hear a lot of words, which it kind of makes sense, but we don't really know what they are. We've got probiotics, prebiotic, postbiotics. We can ferment food. We can pickle food. There's studies, I think Chris Gardner's done some work where he's looked at fiber versus probiotics to see what they're doing and do they synergize. Can you talk to us about this whole world of fermentation and what probiotics are?
Yeah, so to clear up the term, so probiotics are live bacteria. The official definition is not just that they're live bacteria. So not any microbe gets to be a probiotic, but it's a live microbe that has been shown to have a benefit to human health. So it's not just anything. So you can't just let something go moldy on the bench and say, great, that's a probiotic. So be careful with your home fermentation. You want to make sure you've got the good bugs in there. So that's a probiotic. A prebiotic are things like, not all fibers are prebiotics, but prebiotics are the things that feed those good bacteria. So either within the food itself, so if you've got a fermented food that has live bacteria in it, the things within that, so let's think about something like kimchi or sauerkraut. Don't always, when you buy them commercially, by the way, have the live bacteria there, but of course they're used in the process of making that food. But if you've actually got live bacteria there, they're utilizing some of those prebiotics in the food. But then, of course, we also want to eat prebiotics to feed the ones that are already resident within our gut. So we've got probiotics, prebiotics. Sometimes you'll hear the word symbiotics, which is really just a combination of those two things. And then you mentioned postbiotics, and that's kind of a more recent recognition that postbiotics are the things that are metabolites, is the technical word, but the things that are produced by the microbes, either within the food or the drink that you're having and within your gut itself. So things like those short chain fatty acids. What's extraordinary about postbiotics is starting to recognize that even if you don't have live microbes left in the food or the drink, the things that they created still have some benefits. And not only that, but the dead bugs themselves can still act as signaling molecules within the body, which seems really extraordinary. But they're still having an impact. So even if your kimchi and your sauerkraut or your kombucha doesn't have the live bugs in it anymore, I would still suggest trying to look for a good traditional kombucha that does. But if it doesn't, you're still potentially benefiting from some of those substances that are being produced and even from those dead bugs. Now, when we look at what's effective within the body, there's no going past your prebiotics and your fiber mix. Probiotics can't replace that. There's no point in taking probiotics if you're not also going to follow a fiber rich and a fiber diverse diet, because those probiotics, or even if they've got millions of microbes in there, they've got to do the very stressful journey right through the whole gut to reach your colon. When they get to your colon, it's a busy place down there. They've got to try and find real estate. They've got to find somewhere to attach and then to multiply and go. And it's very, very difficult. It's a competitive world down there. So actually what usually happens with probiotics is that you have to keep taking them. They have an effect within the colon. They're having a signal, but they can't quite get their real estate and they tend to then be passed straight through. So they're still potentially having an impact, but you've got to look for the particular strain that's been tested and shown to be a benefit for the particular outcome you're looking for, and then keep taking it. But I would suggest doing that in concert with a high fiber diet and a fiber diverse diet. That's going to give you the best effects. So there's still a lot of maybe controversies, too strong a word, but there's certainly lots we don't understand yet about probiotics. I certainly think we'll see a wealth of information coming out in the research over the coming years to give us better probiotics, better ways of taking them, better ways. I mean, most of those microbes that are present in your colon are anaerobic. So they're in an environment that has no oxygen. So one of the difficulties in creating a probiotic that you take as a capsule or you have in a food is, of course, that these are ones that have to be able to live in air. So now we've got some clever ways of growing these microbes in labs that without oxygen and getting them into capsulated form that can then survive that gut transit. But that's all sort of still relatively new. So I think we'll see that area become more advanced. But at the moment, it's a little, not quite a stab in the dark, but not far off it.
Well, there's no shortage of probiotic that you can buy at any chemist, even just at supermarkets these days. So what is the difference then of eating a probiotic-rich food regularly versus taking a stab in the dark and saying, I'm going to take a probiotic that I can get from the health food shop?
Yeah, I think there's certainly benefits. There's some lovely research coming out on fermented foods, including some from my colleague Felice Jacka at the Food and Mood Centre down in Geelong. They're doing some lovely stuff with her area of interest is mostly in depression. And her previous Smiles trial was the trial that showed that a Mediterranean diet, including lots of fiber-rich foods, actually has the power to impact your mood and to lift depression symptoms. So their work is really key. And yeah, so she has been talking quite a lot about the research. They're looking at fermented foods and how these things can improve your overall health and with a particular interest in mood. So there's undoubtedly research. And what's amazing is I always love to go back to what have we done through time? And if you look at cultures all around the world, almost every culture has used, I mean, they've usually used fermentation as a way of preserving food, making foods available through the winter months or through off-season times when that particular food hasn't been used. Of course, they didn't understand that, in fact, what they were doing was then giving them a health benefit. But we've got these fermented foods from all over the world, fermented ways of pickling and fermenting vegetables, various drinks like kombucha, but there's others that have been used. Fermentation, of course, is also used in producing alcohol because some of that carbohydrate, the sugars are converted to alcohol. So beer and cider and wine are all fermentation processes. So it's extraordinary when we look at that and think almost every culture around the world has fermented. And science now is starting to look at some of these things and say, oh, what's in that? Oh, why might that be benefiting us? So I would say, yes, do include fermented foods in your diet. It's a great idea. Do be careful with some of the commercial drinks in particular that can end up just being sugar-laden soft drinks with a health halo because it says it's fermented and it's got some probiotics in it. So be wary of that. But that's certainly a first-line approach. When it comes to taking a probiotic capsule or supplement, often there's a whole lot of other stuff you could do first. I'm always conscious of people's budgets. If you start taking every supplement under the sun, you're very quickly ramping up your monthly cost of these things. And often you can get them in food. So I'd be very careful about that. Where I would suggest a probiotic is take one under the direction of some sort of a healthcare provider or someone who knows about this stuff. Use the strain of probiotic that's been tested and proven to be effective in that particular outcome, whether it's you've got irritable bowel syndrome or whether you've got inflammatory bowel syndrome, whether you've got traveler's diarrhea, or you want it as a preventative kind of thing when you're traveling. There are some tested strains, and then buy from a reputable company. So often when it comes to food, I'm very supportive of small little companies and local producers. When it comes to supplements, whether it's probiotics or any sort of vitamin or longevity supplement, buy from the big people because they're the ones that are having to test. They're the ones who have a lot to lose if someone tests their product and it's not what it says on the tin. And you need to look for those third-party tested type supplements because there's many cowboys out there who are just benefiting from this extraordinarily lucrative business of selling people supplements.
Is pickling the same thing as fermenting?
Not quite. Pickling doesn't always involve microbes. I mean, you can pickle vegetable. I've got a current obsession with pickled red onion at the moment. So good if you haven't tried it, by the way. Pickled red onion is, you can do it yourself just with water, with vinegar and some sugar into a bowl. And then you can pickle vegetables. So there's not necessarily microbes involved. Whereas fermentation actually involves using, so cheese, produced traditionally cheese, is fermentation and using very specific bacteria, molds or yeasts in order to create that fermentation process. Sourdough bread is using fermentation to get the rise and get the air into the bread. So those are traditionally fermented foods. It's kind of interesting because pickled foods often get thrown in there, and I'm not against pickling, but there is also some potentially negative sides of having too many pickled foods without other things. We know there's a higher rate of gastric cancer, stomach cancer, for example, in some of the Asian countries that are using a lot of pickled foods. So it's just that I guess it's the same as anything we talk about, Tony, would be there's always a sweet range in the middle, and you can get too much of some stuff and you can have not enough. So it's not a case of more is always better. It's got to be in balance and as part of that overall diet.
We've spent most of our time talking about what's good for our gut, but I guess we should also mention what foods or other things we can consume that have a negative effect on the gut. And let's talk about that, and then let's wrap up the conversation with those people who are just intolerant to fiber. But you'll often hear it's not just what you eat, it's things you avoid as well. So what foods or food additives could have a negative effect? And we hear seed oils and we hear inflammatory foods. When you think of foods we should probably avoid for gut health, what stands out to you?
Well, there's some great research that's come out around some of the additives that are put into foods. So we've got this term UPFs now, which stands for ultra processed foods. Now, I like that term because I used to hear and still do often hear people saying, oh, but processed foods are bad. You've got to make that differentiation between ultra processed and processed foods, because cooking at the end of the day is a mechanism of processing, and processing foods often makes food safer. It certainly makes it tastier. And it makes it generally more convenient. Very few of us are living in the country growing our own food and going hunting for our meat and having chickens in the backyard to give us eggs. So those of us living in urban environments who have jobs, we're not producing our own food. So we need food that can sit in the pantry and other people are producing for us. So don't think that all processed foods are bad. However, when we get to ultra-processed foods in particular, they have things like emulsifiers have been shown to have a very negative effect on the gut microbiome and can be damaging to your gut, particularly in those who have things like inflammatory bowel disease or other gut disorders. They can be particularly problematic. We've got an issue around artificial sweeteners. So sweeteners that have, gosh, for a long time now, we've questioned whether they actually help with weight control at all. And it seems that they really don't. Part of that is for all sorts. I'm going down a different tangent here, but triggering your brain to still want something sweet and then not rewarding your brain with the glucose that comes in from something that would be sweet in nature is problematic. You're kind of messing with your system there. But it's certainly now been shown that some of those artificial sweeteners can have a negative impact on your gut microbiome. And that might be part of the mechanisms as to why foods and drinks with artificial sweeteners don't seem to help people with their weight control and may even be detrimental. So we certainly know that some of those additives are bad. We've got, there's less around the colorings is all a bit controversial, but it makes sense to say, stuff doesn't need to be in food. Why are we having it? There's research going on in some of the preservatives that are used in these foods. So I would watch all of that stuff. But the bottom line is most of the issue around ultra processed foods is that we lose fiber. So we lose the stuff that we need. And it's not just fiber, but when you look at if we look at a traditional whole grain, the fiber in the outer layers, and then you've got a sort of starchy endosperm that's not just starch. There's protein and some nutrients in that endosperm too. And we've got clever new products. One of the companies that I'm working with right now is a CSIRO developed grain called Wise Wheat. And it's very clever because they've developed a wheat that's high in a particular resistant starch. So you get this high fiber content within that endosperm right in the center. And that means you can make white flour that's high fiber. Very clever and intrinsic to the grain, not an extracted refined fiber that you've chucked in at the end, which is what most white breads that are high fiber have. They've just got a fiber additive essentially. So that's really important. But in those outer grain, not only have you got the fiber in those layers, but you've also got nutrients. So a lot of B group vitamins, magnesium and some other minerals, and you've got things with antioxidant potentials. So you've got what we call phytonutrients, which just means plant nutrients. So these are all the nearly lost my microphone. These are all the polyphenols and the beta carotenes and the pigments that are in there and the things that have got antioxidant or anti-inflammatory effects. So the problem is not so much around, there are some things in ultra-processed foods which might be harmful to the gut, but it also just means you're missing out on all the things that are potentially beneficial. So whatever the opposite of a win-win is, you've got a lose-lose. You're getting some potentially harmful things as well as not getting the things that can do you some good.
Right. Let's finish by talking about fiber intolerance. For those people who report, I don't do well on fiber, and that's where FODMAPs come into this, or the diagnosis of SIBO.
Yeah.
Is this a thing? How can you work out whether it is a fiber intolerance or whether it's a FODMAP? Maybe you could just briefly speak to those who report being fiber intolerant, and if that is the case, what are these people to do?
Yes, the first thing is to acknowledge that it really is a thing. Fiber can be problematic for some people, but it can be problematic, in fact, and it's likely to be problematic for people who have not been following a high fiber diet and you suddenly add fiber into your diet. So just to reiterate what we said earlier about you need to go slow and increase your fiber slowly. But there are still people for whom some fibers will be, I've yet to come across someone who really all types of fiber is going to be problematic if they work through that stage of how to increase it, because your gut microbiome adapts. Nevertheless, there are, you mentioned FODMAPs. So the low FODMAP diet, or it's now just actually called the FODMAP diet. Monash have renamed their diet. They designed this. They were the experts in this. And they looked at, these are particular, not all fibers. Some of them are fibers and prebiotics. So, but some of them are just little oligosaccharides that get through, and other, not just oligosaccharides, but they're all little short chain carbohydrates, let's call them, that can get through the gut and cause particular problems for some people once they reach the colon, and some people slightly further up. That will depend on your genes. So lactose, for example, can be a problem for people with lactose intolerance. That's the little sugar present in milk and some other dairy foods that if you can't break down lactose, it gets to your colon. The bacteria they have a party with it, and you get symptoms, running to the loo, pain, discomfort, diarrhea, and so on. So you might be just lactose intolerant. And this is where the help of a specialist gut and a dietitian who's actually trained with the FODMAP diet. What the FODMAP diet does, it says, let's take all these little short chain carbohydrates, we cut them all out for a period of sort of between 2 and 6 weeks. For some people, they'll follow that approach and get no symptom improvement. But I think it's something like 70% of people with irritable bowel syndrome, they will feel better on that low FODMAP diet. But it's not designed to be a diet for life, because we know that it does then impact the gut microbiome. And for most people, not all of those FODMAPs are a problem. There's only some of those foods. So your dietitian will then help to guide you through a period of introducing and testing either little groups of FODMAPs or particular foods to work out what's your personal threshold. Are there things, for a lot of people, it's just garlic and onions. They cut garlic and onions. There's two of the most common problematic foods. And what's really important to remember, though, is that that doesn't mean these foods are a problem for all of us. Actually, these foods are incredibly beneficial for most of us. And those little short chain fructans and fructooligosaccharides, these little short chain carbohydrates that are present in there, are actually good for us. But for someone who's got irritable bowel, maybe because of their particular gut microbiome or reasons that we're yet to recognize, they're problematic. And so you might then have to cut those things out. But you've gone back to having all your whole grains, you've gone back to having your dairy foods, you've gone back to having some of these other groups of foods that have these different FODMAPs in there. So you end up with a very personalized type approach. For other people, they just benefit from that diet in the short term until they've sorted out whatever's causing the gut issues. And then your gut microbiome shifted or changed, or you've solved whatever the particular issue was in your diet or in your lifestyle. And then you can go back to a more normal diet. So I think the thing to remember is that this is a dynamic thing. You can be diagnosed with something, you have to deal with it, but in the long term, things have shifted and changed, and you have to be ready to go and alter with that. The other last thing to say on that point is that we can also change as we get older. So a lot of gut issues might start happening later in life. You can even develop allergies later in life. People have reported that all of a sudden they've got an food allergy to a particular food that they've spent their whole life eating. So there's all sorts of weird stuff that can happen as you get older. So yeah, I think seek out help. And the researchers at Monash will be the first to tell you, don't try and do a FODMAP diet on your own. Get the help of a FODMAP trained dietitian who will walk you through the steps and help support you to make sure that you don't end up with a terribly restricted diet that's cutting out potentially beneficial foods in your diet and making life pretty unpleasant. They'll help you get to a stage where you've got a really nice balance of the foods you can tolerate.
Oh, that's a great message. What do you do? Let's wrap up by that in terms, do you drink coffee? Do you drink alcohol? How much fiber do you have? Give us a bit of insight into what you're doing.
Yeah, I have a very high fiber diet, but I'm accustomed to it. So that's the other thing is just to make sure that you're going back to what you're accustomed to. I eat the way that I believe we all have a foundation of what's really important for what we all do. And then you can personalize it to you. So I have a little pyramid that I talk about for personalized nutrition. And at the foundation of that is a plant-rich diet. And I do eat animal food. So I'm very much an omnivore. So I do eat red meat. There's not many things the only thing I don't eat are ultra processed foods. So I have a very diverse range. I try to eat lots of different plant foods. A typical breakfast for me is either sort of overnight oats, porridge, muesli type breakfast I always eat berries almost every day with my nuts and seeds, with my Greek yogurt to boost the protein and the calcium. I'm 52. I know I need extra protein across the day. I know I need extra calcium. So I'm getting those things into my breakfast, or I alternate that with having eggs but if I'm having eggs, I always have my whole grain sourdough, my avocado. I have mushrooms and spinach or whatever veggies, often Brussels sprouts. I know people think that's weird, but Brussels sprouts with your eggs is honestly, don't knock it till you've tried it. Extra virgin olive oil, that kind of a breakfast. So it's one of those, I sort of alternate between those two things. I try to get plants into every meal that I'm having. I spread my protein load across the day, whether it's eggs and dairy or meat. I try to fish a few times a week. And that's really the way that I eat. I'm trying to eat plant foods from veggies, fruits, nuts and seeds, whole grains and legumes across those different groups. My extra virgin olive oil is really important. There's great research around 2 to 3 tablespoons a day. So that's the only oil you'll find in my pantry, but just different flavors. of extra virgin olive oil. And that's the way I like to eat. And I'm very much a foodie and I cook. I'm always having to create recipes for some of my work on Good Chef, Bad Chef. I'm always trying to create new recipes. And so food is a great love of mine. So the last thing I think, which is maybe a nice point to finish on, is that let's not forget the joy of food. Food should be a pleasurable part of your day, not a stress. And I think sometimes, perhaps particularly in the fitness and health industries, we get so focused on what's a healthy diet and what should I be eating that it becomes a stress and all these complicated protocols. And I never count my macros. I don't think about how many calories I'm eating. I don't even think about grams of fiber. I just think about what are the actual foods. I'm very much a big picture person. And keeping that joy, sharing a meal, going to someone's house for dinner or having people to your house, those things are really important and just as important as what's actually on the plate. And we mustn't lose sight of that in our quest for whatever the optimal diet is. And the last point I'll make then is make it personalized. Going back to my little pyramid of personalized nutrition, that foundation of a plant-rich, if you're happy to eat animal foods, it's a good idea to give you nutrients. But then layer over the top of that, what's your cultural background? I'm Scottish. Don't tell me I can't eat potatoes. My partner's from the Middle East. We have to have hummus almost every day. My ex was Italian, so we ate a lot of pasta. These foods culturally are really, really important. And then you've got your medical conditions, whether you've got any gut issues or other medical problems, allergies and intolerances. Then you've got your genetic makeup. You've got your own unique gut microbiome. And don't forget your likes and dislikes. I often say if you hate kale, you don't have to eat kale. There's other green veggies you can be having. I love Brussels sprouts. If Brussels sprouts are not your thing, fine, choose another veggie on the plate. So if you really don't want to eat animal foods, it's fine. There's other things. You're just going to have more legumes. And you can't eat low carb if you're going to be entirely plant-based. You can be lower carb, lower fat, higher fat. There's all sorts of different variations, provided we've got that key foundation.
Well, that is very sensible. Great chatting with you. You have a new book coming out. Is this your 9th or 10th book?
I think it's my 9th. I think it's mine. I'm right in saying it's my 9th. I have to count them all up properly.
Are you going to
I've
read?
got 4 Audibles. So this is my first published book in a long time.
Okay. Now, are you going to read it for Audible? Because I love the Scottish accent. It's my favorite accent.
Do you know, that's so funny. The team at Audible, I did the Audible books during COVID and I said, do you want me to narrate them too? And they said, absolutely. And apparently the Scottish accent is accepted universally. So that's a good thing.
It's a great accent. You should get into reading all of the books. So it's about fiber. Have you called it Break Like the Wind? I think that's a great title for the book.
Tony, I've still got the opportunity to put this forward. Well, actually, I just submitted my manuscript, but at the moment I've given them 2 titles because really what I want to call it is Holy Shit, the Case for Fibre. But I'm getting a little bit of pushback and we're just trying to decide whether the book retailer's not going to be happy with that as a title. Right. So my backup is The Fibre Effect, but actually Break Like the Wind, I quite like that, Tony. Watch the space. I shall update you. But yes, it will be released in Australia in February. So
fantastic.
Yes,
I can't wait to read. I've got most of your books in my office here, and you are an incredible communicator of the science into practical recommendations. Where can people find more? Are you on social media? Do you have a website?
Yes, my website's very easy. It's just drjoanna.com. So Dr. Joanna, all one word. On social, you'll find me just at Dr. Joanna McMillan. And I have started a Substack. So I'm finding if you haven't got onto Substack yet, it's a great way of communicating. So I post written articles, but also I've got a very early stage podcast where it's just me at the moment, but I'm hoping to develop that further called Delicious Science. So you'll find me on Substack and then the podcast goes out on Apple Podcasts and on Spotify if you'd rather listen there. And yeah, the book will also be an Audible version. So you can listen while you're working out, doing the housework, going for a walk, in the car, all that stuff. So yes, you'll find me easily online.
Thank you so much, Joe. I always appreciate talking with you.
Thanks for having me on, Tony.
Thanks for tuning into the Stronger with Time podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing or sharing it with someone who would benefit from hearing this. And if you're ready to go deeper, the 9-week Science of Thriving course is available now. The link is in the show notes.